Every time that I've tried one of Sony's XM series headphones, frankly, I've been pretty disappointed in the sound quality. Since even before I considered myself an audiophile, I've always thought that these headphones just frankly don't sound very good. But the XM6 that we're taking a look at today, well, it's got a new feature that frankly, I think a lot of other reviewers are not giving enough credit. And I think it changes the game for this headphone. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review. And for the past couple of weeks, I've been listening to the Sony WH-1000XM6, which is still a terrible name for a headphone, but is now finally a Bluetooth headphone that I actually want to listen to. See, I've actually, in the past years, I've bought the Sony XM3 and the XM5 wanting to like this form factor in this headphone, but frankly, they just don't sound very good, and I end up actually giving them away. The XM6, however, I don't think I'm going to give this one away. In this review, we are going to talk about build quality, fit, and comfort. We'll talk a little bit about the features, but mostly I want to talk about one feature in particular that makes this headphone better than all the other XM headphones, and frankly, possibly the best Bluetooth noise canceling headphone I've ever tried. If you are not familiar with this headphone, it is the latest from Sony. The price is $450 US, and I guess I'll have it linked in the description down below, but let's start by just talking about what comes inside the box. We'll talk about the physical form factor and build quality, and then we'll get into talking about the sound stuff, which is, frankly, what makes this headphone so unique for me. So here's the box, all right? Pretty simple cardboard box. I dig it. What you get inside of it is what you see here on the table, although there is also just a USB-C cable. I call it micro because it's quite short, you can see, but that's for charging the headphone, and then it does also come with a standard 3.5mm to 3.5mm analog cable in case you want to run the headphone directly out of a digital audio player or a laptop or something that still has one of these on it. Now, you can use this headphone entirely passive. You can see that it's got a 3.5mm receiver there. You can use it with the battery dead, and you can still listen to the thing. But I'm gonna tell you right now, you don't want to. It sounds awful when the headphone is turned off. However, even using the cable, as I found out, you can actually still listen to it with the headphone turned on. Although, interestingly, none of the EQ features appear to stick with it. It appears that you just get the stock sound. So, quick note on that. Apart from that, here's what else you get inside the box is you get this little carry case. When by little, okay, it's actually quite compact. It's not as small, quite as small as the case that came with the XM3, but it's pretty compact, and I like it. I don't know, it's just nice and svelte, pretty slim, and then it's got this magnetic closure on the side rather than having a zipper all the way around, which just makes it nice and easy to open up and get into. There is also a little handle here that folds inside, and I thought that was kind of a clever touch there. In case you don't want that, you can kind of pretend it doesn't exist. But generally, a very nicely built case, but mostly we're here to talk about this headphone, so let's talk about the build quality and form factor on the headphone. I'm gonna start by just talking about my thoughts on the aesthetics, because frankly, I think this is a really handsome headphone, and I think that that was also true of the XM5. And this just is kind of a continuation of it. I was a little bit worried that it would feel a little bigger and clunkier than the XM5, but I feel like in the hand and on my head, which I'll show you what it looks like in a little bit, this actually came together really well. It comes in a couple of different colors. It comes in this white color, it comes in a black color, of course, and there's also kind of a cool midnight blue color that looks interesting, but I just have always been attracted to this color of the Sony XM5 and now the XM6. Kind of reminds me of an old school PlayStation. I dig it. Now, the materials on this thing are, well, I'm kind of two minds about it. They don't feel especially premium in a lot of ways. Like, it kind of just feels like a lightweight piece of plastic, and well, I mean, it kind of is. There's just a lot of plastic materials here. Obviously, you know, if you're used to a typical nearly $500 headphone, you're probably used to feeling more like metal and like leather materials and stuff like that. But this is all pretty much optimized for lightweightness, which they did achieve. It is a very lightweight headphone. On my scale, I think it weighed at 253 grams, which is pretty in line with what they claim. And that makes it basically as light as the Sony XM3. And that's an older headphone that came out a while ago. So they've added new features and continually upgraded it, but they haven't made it heavier, which is nice to see. Maybe I'm just too used to the car world where that's pretty much exactly what happens. But apart from that, weight stuff, which is good, the materials are just, yeah, like I was kind of already saying, they're pretty plasticky. And there is one, I would say, somewhat significant downside to the plasticiness of it is just that as I'm handling the headphone, there's kind of like a lot of microphonic high frequency sound. I don't know if I can get this to come through on the microphone there. But it is nonetheless something that I'm aware of. Not so much when I'm just holding the headphone like this. That would seem like a silly complaint. I agree. You're already thinking that. I can feel the judging. But for me, when I put the thing on my head, all right, and I am just handling the headphone, there's just a lot of like high frequency sound from the rubbing of my hand on it, which is, you know, it's a thing that reminds you that the headphone is not made out of more premium materials. But again, the lightweightness is, I think, a pretty fair trade-off. Now, the pad material is also kind of an interesting trade-off because it is not particularly plush again. Like it feels not really like a faux leather like you might expect. It feels more like it's like a vinyl or something like that. It's interesting. I'll say as far as comfort, that's good. We'll talk a little bit more about comfort in a bit, but just in terms of materials, again, it just doesn't feel especially premium. Now, what I'd really like about it, however, in terms of the build quality and the construction, is just how solid a headphone it is, right? If I like shake it around, there's really no clacking or anything like that, which, okay, you probably don't do that with your headphones very much, but I think it's just kind of indicative of the general handling experience of this headphone, is that it feels nice and solid. You can see that, you know, it's not floppy. The ear cups aren't flopping themselves around all the place, even though it does fold up, which, you know, is, I guess, a nice touch. But yeah, it just feels like a really solid, well-built piece of kit, despite the fact that the materials are quite plastic and, again, not necessarily premium feeling. Okay, now in terms of comfort, where should we start? I'm going to start by just describing this headphone real quick, or sorry, the headband. I was a little bit concerned about this thing because it is pretty narrow, and usually narrow headbands, what I worry about is creating a hot spot along the top of my head right here. And this is one there where when I initially put this thing on my head, I do feel it a little bit, but it's interesting because it doesn't end up being so much of an issue for me in the long run. I'm still nonetheless interested in finding a solution. I think capper strap is probably going to have an option for me to make this a little bit more comfortable, but as it is out of the box, it actually ends up being not so bad. It's interesting that they went with kind of like a boxy, kind of squared off design rather than having something a little bit more, I don't know, parabolic, as you might find in a more traditional headphone design. So that part is, I would say, actually pretty good in terms of comfort. The other thing to talk about with comfort is these ear cups, which are frankly a little bit on the compact side. So this is still an over-ear fitting headphone. Your ear will fit entirely inside of it, but it is on the small side. And as you can see, the ear pad depth is not very deep, and the ear pads are pretty squishy. So you're mostly, like, as you put this thing on your head, you're mostly just putting this whole thing against the side of your ear. To me, it kind of feels like lying down on a pillow, which actually sounds pretty pleasant. But if you're used to a more traditional headphone design like this, where you've got a deep ear pad and you're kind of like putting your ear inside of like an enclosed room, you really don't get that effect here with the XM series headphones. It's true of this one, but it's also been true of the other ones. I think that some of that noise cancellation and isolation that they also get partly from the technology, but also just by covering your ear, frankly, with a lot of headphones. So it does do that. As far as the materials go, though, again, it doesn't feel necessarily premium. It kind of just feels like a plastic vinyl. But I found it fairly comfortable. You know, again, it's pretty plush, it's pretty soft, and it's a pretty cozy feeling headphone. I guess I'll throw it more on my head and give you a view of what it looks like on my head. And yeah, again, it's lightweight. Clamp is decent, like it's going to stay in place. I feel like I could go running with this, not that I have, but it doesn't feel like it's squishing my head together, which is generally pretty good. And again, I think that the biggest issue with the comfort is just how cramped it is inside of here. Hasn't been an issue for me, but if you know that it might be for you, just as a heads up. The other thing that I'll point out real quickly is that it's interesting, if you feel around in this ear cup, you can feel that there is kind of this protruding bit of plastic in here. I assume it's like a microphone of some sort, and it's behind this really soft mesh that probably when you put this in your ear is going to compress this. Now for me, this is not a problem. I don't feel this in my ear, but I will say that it is potentially something that might bother you depending on the shape of your own anatomy. But yeah, I don't know, not much else to say about the physical form factor. Let me check my notes real quick. But generally, actually pretty happy with this thing. Okay, one other thing I want to mention. It's going to be a small complaint about the fit and comfort. is it does fold, right? So I showed you how it folds up to fit inside the case, right? It does this sort of thing. And then the ear cups fold flat, which I like because you can put this on a table and then you get the pads touching the table rather than like hard plastics and stuff like that, which I think is good. And then you can also fold it completely flat this way so that when you wear it around your neck, and I hope I don't hit my microphone too much when I do this, it'll lie flat against your chest, which this is the orientation that I like ear cups to rotate flat, is against my chest. Now, that said, when I do this, it does kind of come up against the bottom of my chin and my neck quite tight. It's not the most comfortable headphone to wear around my neck. And I know that's not the main place that a headphone will be worn, but it's definitely a thing that I do a lot when I'm wearing a headphone. So I like to take it off, have a place to put it. My neck is a convenient place to put it. And I will say that this is not the best neck wearing headphone. It's probably where it is weakest in terms of its comfort, but I don't know, maybe a fairly minor point. So that does it for my thoughts here on the physical form factor, build quality, comfort, and stuff like that. So let's talk about the functionality, which mostly I'm going to focus on, not noise canceling and Bluetooth and all that stuff, because you can watch other reviews. This is a complicated product. There are a lot of things that I could be talking about, but mostly I just want to talk about the sound stuff. So real quickly on functionality stuff, the noise canceling is good, okay? I'm not a big noise canceling person. I mean, I like that it does noise canceling. That's part of why I like this thing, but I'm not going to get into like which headphone cancels out the absolute most amount of noise. Well, I'll leave that to the other reviewers. The things that I will point out about noise canceling are actually a couple of downsides, that just some things to keep in mind and some things that I think other headphone manufacturers should start just kind of taking into consideration. So for one, these are the microphones, right? These little silver things all along the outside of it. And I point that out just because as I'm handling this headphone, right, putting it on and off my head, you know, repositioning it or activating buttons and stuff like that, I find myself rubbing these microphones. And what happens is when you do that, it will play back some high frequency rubbing through the microphones, which frankly is just not that pleasant. It just kind of sounds like noise or static, right? So that's kind of annoying. I think more importantly for me, however, is, and this is a common issue with a lot of noise canceling stuff. So I don't know, I feel like this is something that can be fixed, but it's just when you are out in the wind with this thing, the microphones will pick up that wind noise, turn it into high frequency static noise that then gets played back in through the speakers. If you're using noise canceling, it'll do it a little bit. If you're listening to this thing in like a transparency ambient sound mode, it'll do it a lot. And frankly, I found that to be kind of a disappointing limit of the use of those features, because when you're outside, I personally like the transparency mode. You know, I mostly used to using bone conduction headphones, so I like having my hearing open. But unfortunately, when any kind of wind blew by, it was pretty annoying and irritating to hear that high frequency noise get passed in through there. So there's a small complaint. Now, other stuff to talk about, Bluetooth functionality was generally pretty good. It supports multi-point, which is nice, although sometimes it wouldn't connect to both of my phones or both of my products. So I would connect it to my my laptop and my phone at the same time. And sometimes it would just, actually probably half the time I turn this thing on, I have to manually connect it to the other device. So not entirely reliable there, but mostly good. But mostly what I wanted to talk about in terms of functionality has nothing to do with that stuff. It actually has to do with this app, right? I talked about this thing having a game-changing new feature, and it absolutely does. And it has to do with the EQ controls of this device. So this is what the app looks like. I'll dive into the equalizer over here and just briefly talk about, okay, so it's got ambient sound mode. We talked a little bit about that. It's got these listening modes where you might have heard that this thing will simulate listening to music inside of a cafe, which almost kind of sounds like an interesting way to listen to music, like maybe listen to some lo-fi beats in a cafe scenario. I don't recommend it. It sounds awful. I would never use it, frankly. It sounds kind of like listening to music in a bathroom, which probably doesn't sound too appealing. But here's what is very useful, okay? It is this section here called the equalizer. And, well, there's a bunch of presets in here, right? So gain, soft, hard, clear. What do those mean? I mean, you can listen to them and see if you like them for yourself. I have them all measured on SquigLink, which I'll have linked in the description down below, the frequency response graph, so you can see exactly what differences they're making. Although, you know, the little visual here gives you a good idea. Clear gives it more treble. Heavy gives it more bass, all right? and off is just kind of like the default sound signature. Now, why all this stuff is so important for me is I think the default sound of these headphones is frankly awful. And I think that that was also true of the XM3, also true of the XM5. I never heard the XM4, but I can put one on one together. So I don't think that these headphones sound very good. And frankly, these EQ profiles here, they change it a little bit, but they don't really change the game. What does change the game is the manual control options, okay? Now, this has always been true of the other Sony XM headphones. You can manually change the settings of the XM5 and the XM3. But what's big and what's different here is the fact that this is now a 10-band EQ. And I cannot understate enough, or I cannot overstate enough, how big of a difference that makes. Going from a 5-band EQ to a 10-band EQ, where you've got all of your adjustment sliders at, octaves starting at 32 hertz all the way up to 16 kilohertz. This right here means that that stock sound I don't like, I can fix, okay? With the old sliders and the old headphones, I really, really tried to get the XM5 to sound good. I could not get it to sound anywhere near what I wanted to. But with these, I absolutely can, because the sliders are just well positioned, and they give you ample control. You can basically go plus or minus 6 decibels with each slider. And they're pretty well placed given the frequency response of the headphone, which again, I've got up on Squiggly if you want to check it out. That's linked in the description down below. But I think that will probably lead us into talking about the sound quality on this headphone. And I don't think, I'm just checking my notes to make sure. Oh, the one last thing I wanted to mention before I leave you is that I had a lot of fun playing around with the EQ stuff in here. And in fact, I'm planning to do another video where I talk specifically about my EQ for the XM6. If you want to find out exactly how I tune this headphone, why I tune it this way, and how you can too, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, all that stuff, and that'll be coming up in a couple of days. But let's talk about the sound here on this headphone. And like I like to do, I like to analyze this through frequency response graphs. So this is the frequency response of the XM6 stock out of the box. This is what it sounds like. And if you're not used to looking at these, think of this dotted line in the background as what roughly neutral sounds like. And anytime the darker line goes below or above that line, those are ways in which it sounds colored, right? It doesn't sound entirely neutral. And I'm not the kind of guy that thinks that everything needs to sound exactly neutral, but it's a good reference point, right? And if, again, you're not used to looking at this stuff, down here and kind of like below, let's say 200 hertz, this is all bass. This is all kind of like the mid-range, and then the top end is your treble, your high frequency stuff. And what you'll probably notice on this headphone is, no surprise, there is gobs of bass. And that's been true of the other Sony XM headphones. And it's frankly why I don't think that they sound very good. I know people like to have a lot of bass. For some people, there's no such thing as too much bass. But here's what I'm going to say, all right? I think there is such thing as too much bass, not just for like my personal preferences. I mean, obviously it always is down to personal preferences. But I think that when you have bass, this much bass in this way, it ruins the qualities of the bass that I think people are looking for, right? I think like good bass has got like a nice snappiness to it, right? It's got a punch, there's like kind of a physicality behind it, and you feel it. It's not so much that it's just this dominating thing, which is what you get when you have lots of bass, like on this headphone out of the box. I don't think that that's good quality sound, and I feel like, well, I don't know, that would actually be an interesting test. Test my EQ versus a stock sound and see which one do most people like best. I don't know if I'm willing to subject myself to that. But sorry, back to the frequency response graph. There's a lot of bass here. All right, the mid-range is a little bit on the recessed side, and you get kind of this upper mid-range lift and treble, which frankly actually are pretty well tuned. This whole top end doesn't need a whole lot of work, which is a lot more than I can say about the XM3 and the XM5. So this much is actually pretty good and a good starting point to go at it with those EQ features. It's just that, the mid-range is a little bit recessed and there's just a little bit too much bass, and it ends up kind of sounding underwater, muffled and congested. And frankly, I just don't think that this sounds very good. This sounds like the Sony XM sound that I'm frankly pretty used to. But again, with the EQ features, you can improve it. I'll pull up the frequency response that I measured on this headphone after I EQ'd it. And this this is a sound I can really get behind. Like, it's got this nice clean neutral. It's got not quite a brightness to it, but it's got a little bit of a liveliness to it. And you'll see that I didn't remove all of the bass, right? I think that this headphone is, people that are looking at this headphone want it to be, you know, have nice bass. And here I've left in a decent amount of the sub bass here. So you get some of that tactility, you get some of that physicality, and you hear kind of like the sub bass rumble and the texturing and bass guitars and stuff like that. And kick drums come through with a nice authoritative thwack. But it does it all without having any of that muddy, boxy, boomy sound. And you get a nice, clear, transparent mid-range, you get nice vocal presence. And the top end, I think, is generally actually pretty well tuned. Now, I did have a little bit of issues with the treble being a little bit rough. Here in the frequency response, I don't know, I should have done sweeps on my head, so I don't know exactly. But here it looks like, you know, it could be in this range where it's a little bit on the rough side. And unfortunately, you know, the sliders, I have a slider at 8 kilohertz and I have a slider at 16 kilohertz. It would be nice to have a couple more sliders here in the upper treble area to really dial it in and fix it. But what I will say is that as long as I leave some amount of bass down here, it does a decent enough job of counterbalancing any sharpness or roughness in the treble, and just overall ends up making the XM6, frankly, a very pleasant listen, which is not just more than what I can say for, frankly, any other noise-canceling Bluetooth headphone from Sony or Bose, but is more than I can say for most closed-back headphones to begin with. Now, this is not going to compete with your average open-back headphone. Like a Sennheiser HD600, frankly, still, in my opinion, smashes this in terms of sound quality. But if you're assuming you want a noise-canceling closed-back headphone, this is a very different use case from an HD600. And frankly, again, it sounds good enough that I actually really enjoy listening to music on this thing. In fact, I would say that versus my previous favorite noise-canceling headphone, which would be this, the Focal Batiste, out of the box, I think the Batiste 100% sounds better than the XM6. Like, it's got a nice bit of contrast, it's got some nice physicality in the bass, it's a little bit on the warm side, but it is a very, very pleasant listen. Whereas, again, this is just Mud City. But with the EQ features, unfortunately, the Batiste actually does not have very good EQ features, especially since it's from an audiophile company. You might expect it to have some, but it's only got 5 sliders, and the positioning of the sliders is frankly actually just almost useless when it comes to especially like the upper mid-range. Whereas here on the Sony, the sliders, it's got more sliders, it's got 10, and they're much better positioned given the frequency response. So after EQ, the overall tonality, I definitely prefer on the Sony XM. I think in terms of like the more technical words that we'll use, like the punch and slam, there's still a little bit of extra dynamic sound that I get to the bass out of the Focal. It's got a little bit more punch and physicality behind it, but frankly, it's pretty close after the EQ, and the tonality balance is just so much better on the XM. Like the vocals, timbre and stuff to me sounds better once I EQ it versus the Batiste that, frankly, this is just now my new favorite sounding Bluetooth headphone, kind of bar none. And I don't know, I think that's about as much as I can talk about the sound on this headphone. Yeah, frankly, I'm in love with the EQ features, frankly. I think it's kind of easy to miss how subtle a change it is, going from 5 bands of EQ, they're not very well positioned, to 10 bands that are well positioned given the frequency response of the headphone. You're able to take a frequency response that, frankly, doesn't look that great, turn it into something that kind of does look pretty good, and it also sounds really good on my head. So yeah, I don't know, out of 5 stars, the Sony XM6, I'm actually gonna give this thing 4 stars out of 5. Which this is the highest I've rated any of these Sony Bluetooth headphones. This is, I think, the best one that they've done yet. If you want to check it out, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, because again, I'm going to do my tutorial on how to EQ this headphone. Subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me in Discord, also linked in the description, and I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.
Joined with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's begin with the theory.